In the world of suburban bliss where lawns are pristine and smiles are exchanged over garden fences, dark secrets often lurk just beneath the surface. Welcome to True Crime Sketches, where we plunge headfirst into the most twisted, shocking, and perplexing tales of human nature's darker side. Today we unravel the chilling and convoluted story of Richard Engelbert, a man whose seemingly picture-perfect life shattered under the weight of secrecy, lies, and brutal betrayal. Richard Engelbert wasn't just any man in Littleton, Colorado. He was the man, a charismatic, successful real estate agent, always seen cruising around town in his polished black car, proudly sporting the license plate sexy Realtor. To the outside world, Richard had it all: a flourishing career, a beautiful home, a family that seemed tight-knit. He was married to Wendy, the no-nonsense principal of a local school, and had a stepson, Harrison, who was growing up under the shadow of his success. The image Richard painted was pristine. He had graduated from the University of Colorado with a degree in business and spent over 2 decades climbing the ladder in the competitive real estate market. Neighbors saw him regularly, waving and smiling as he meticulously groomed the lawn of his large 2-story house, a symbol of his success. He was the kind of man who would sponsor the local Little League teams and make sure to show up at charity events, donning his best suit, flashing that same dazzling smile. Sundays were spent at church, sitting in the front pew with Wendy, reinforcing the illusion of a man whose life was as flawless as his lawn. But beneath that polished exterior, Richard's life was anything but. For 2 long years, he had been concealing a secret so dark, so devastating, that it gnawed away at him day after day. Richard was in a sexual relationship with his stepson, Harrison, a secret he carried with the kind of shame and guilt that would make any man unravel. Yet this wasn't the only double life Richard led. His rendezvous with Harrison weren't enough to quell his desires. He was meeting other men as well, using the very homes he showed to clients as hidden sanctuaries for his clandestine affairs. Every door he unlocked with a key was one more gateway into a life of deceit. As Richard's hidden world grew more complicated, so did his inner turmoil. In the days leading up to his death, he appeared outwardly as composed as ever, closing deals, meeting clients, and maintaining his charm. Yet behind the curtain, Richard was a man on the brink, trying to keep his web of lies from collapsing. His weekends promised brief reprieves. One was a trip to the Bahamas with Wendy, an attempt to escape the chaos and reset. Another, a 4th of July barbecue, was a chance to lose himself in the company of old friends, hoping that perhaps, just for a few hours, he could forget who he truly was. But Richard's smile had become a mask, and that mask was slipping. Friends, unaware of the storm brewing beneath, described him as charming and easygoing, a man who could light up a room. But Richard's charm was eroding under the pressure of his hidden life. The weight of his affair with Harrison and his fear of discovery were suffocating him. He knew if Wendy ever found out, his marriage, and the perfect image he had built in his community, would disintegrate. The day everything came crashing down started like any other. June 27, 2014. Wendy had finished her day at the school earlier than usual. She was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, maybe a bit of Netflix and the comfort of her latest book. As she walked through the front door of their home on Bleak Street, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She placed her keys on the counter and called out for Richard. Silence. The house was eerily still. With a slight twinge of unease, Wendy moved through the house, her footsteps almost unnaturally loud against the hardwood floor. Perhaps he was in the basement, she thought. Richard often retreated there to work on real estate files or lose himself in hours of the History Channel. But when she reached the basement door, she noticed something that set her heart racing. The door was ajar. That was unusual. She called his name again, louder this time. Still nothing. Descending the stairs, Wendy's breath caught in her throat. The basement, a place of refuge, had become a scene straight out of a nightmare. There, sprawled on the floor, lay Richard's lifeless body. Blood splattered the carpet and furniture, evidence of a brutal struggle. His face, once so charismatic and inviting, was now bruised and swollen beyond recognition. Around his neck, a men's luxury belt was tightened in a grotesque knot, the instrument of his death. Wendy's scream pierced the heavy silence, a cry of pure terror. She dropped to her knees beside him, shaking his body, as if willing him to wake up. But it was too late. Richard was gone. In shock and disbelief, Wendy fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. Her voice broke as she pleaded with the operator. "My husband, I think." The operator's calm voice on the other end instructed her to stay on the line. But for Wendy, nothing could bring calm to the chaos that had just consumed her world. Richard Engelbert's life, filled with secrets, lies, and hidden desires, had finally come undone in the most tragic, violent way possible. A man who had lived two lives had now lost them both. The story of his murder remains a tangled web, one that exposes the dark corners of desire, guilt, and deception lurking behind the most charming of facades. Wendy's hands trembled as she sat across from Detective James Cattle in the small, sterile interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting a harsh glare on the table between them. She stared down at her hands, still red and raw from the hours she had spent wringing them, unable to shake the image of Richard's lifeless body from her mind. She hadn't slept. How could she? Her husband, dead, brutally murdered, and now here she was, the first suspect in his death. Detective Cattle, a man of few words but sharp instincts, had spent years unraveling stories just like this one. He leaned forward, his gaze steady but not unkind. He knew how to walk the fine line between empathy and suspicion. "Wendy," he began, his voice low and calm, "I know this is difficult." Wendy took a shaky breath, her voice quivering as she spoke. "I told you everything. I came home early. It was just supposed to be a quiet evening, but I found him. I couldn't—" Her words trailed off as her eyes filled with tears again. She had no answers, only the crushing weight of disbelief. Detective Cattle nodded, maintaining his patient demeanor, but the gears in his mind were already turning. He had seen this reaction before: wives, husbands, friends, family. Everyone always claimed they couldn't fathom the who or why, but someone had done this. And Wendy, no matter how distraught, was not above suspicion. The investigation had already begun peeling back the layers of Richard's life, and what they found wasn't the clean-cut image he had projected to the world. The sexy realtor who waved to his neighbors and attended church every Sunday had been living a double life. Secret relationships, late-night rendezvous, and now, mounting questions about whether those secrets had caught up to him. Cattle asked the next question gently, though he knew it could trigger a reaction. "Wendy, did you know about Richard's—" Wendy's eyes snapped up, her confusion clear. "Other life?" The detective studied her carefully. "We found some from men and phone calls. It looks like Richard had been meeting people, using the homes he showed as private meeting places." For a moment, Wendy's face was a blank slate, as if she hadn't processed what was just said. Then her expression crumpled, and she let out a broken laugh, more of a sob. "I had no idea. None of it. I thought he was just—" The revelation hit Wendy like a tidal wave. The perfect life she thought she had, the loving husband she believed she knew, was crumbling away. Detective Cattle didn't press her further on that subject. He would get more answers, but not now. Wendy's reactions seemed genuine enough, and for the moment, she wasn't a flight risk. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation room, the Littleton Police Department was working tirelessly, dissecting every angle of Richard Engelbert's secret life. They combed through his phone records, tracked down the men he had been involved with, and began to piece together a narrative that Richard had been living a life of high-risk behavior. It wasn't just infidelity. It was the kind of secret that could destroy reputations, livelihoods, and perhaps provoke violence. But if it wasn't Wendy, who had motive? Could one of Richard's lovers have snapped, driven by jealousy or fear of exposure? Or was it someone entirely different, lurking in the shadows of his complicated life? As the investigation stretched into the evening, the Engelbert house, now cordoned off by yellow crime scene tape, became the epicenter of speculation. Neighbors gathered, whispering theories and spreading rumors. Lubby Johnson Gant, Wendy's neighbor, spoke to reporters in hushed tones. She described the horror of finding Wendy on the front steps, broken and incoherent. "She was devastated," Lubby said, shaking her head. "I just don't understand who would do this. Richard was always so kind. But sense wasn't something the police were after. They wanted facts, evidence, and a killer. And slowly those pieces were starting to come together." Later that week, Detective Cattle and his team received the results of the DNA analysis conducted at the crime scene. Hair fibers, skin cells, and traces of blood. Some of it belonging to Richard, but some of it belonging to someone else. Someone who had been there, fighting Richard in those final moments. The clues were beginning to converge. Richard hadn't gone down without a fight. Whoever had killed him hadn't been careful enough to avoid leaving traces of themselves behind. The net was closing in. In the quiet town of Littleton, the idyllic calm that once blanketed the community had been replaced by fear and uncertainty. Who could have done this to a man so deeply embedded in the fabric of the town? And what other secrets might still be buried beneath the surface? As Detective Cattle prepared for another round of questioning, he knew one thing for sure. Richard Engelbert's murder wasn't just a crime of passion. It was the end result of a life built on deception, and now the truth was clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be revealed. Investigation was becoming more convoluted by the hour. Each new revelation seemed to twist the narrative, exposing layers of deceit, betrayal, and deeply tangled relationships that left the Littleton Police Department reeling. Detective James Cattle, ever methodical, knew that Richard Engelbert's murder wasn't just about one thing. It was a storm of emotions, desires, and hidden lives that had collided in a deadly crescendo. Wendy's release hadn't quelled the police's suspicions entirely. Though her alibi was airtight and her cooperation full, there remained an intangible weight over her. The detectives couldn't help but wonder if she was hiding more than she let on. Perhaps not directly involved, but privy to secrets she hadn't fully revealed. Her shock and anger over Richard's affair had been visceral. But as Detective Cattle had learned in his years of experience, grief and guilt often wore the same face. And now, with the involvement of her own son Harrison, the tension between these family members was more palpable than ever. As the investigation continued, Harrison Engelbert found himself at the heart of suspicion. Despite his alibi being corroborated, his confession about the affair with Richard placed him in a particularly vulnerable light. His resentment, his rage was all too real. Detective Cattle couldn't ignore the fire behind Harrison's eyes as he talked about Richard's betrayal. The stepson had spoken of feeling manipulated, used and discarded, his emotions a tangle of love, anger, and confusion. Richard, the man he had once seen as both father figure and lover, had shattered whatever fragile bond they had left. The tension in Harrison's words had been unmistakable. Yet his alibi, solidified by bartending colleagues who saw him that night, put him far from the scene of the crime during the crucial hours. The messages on his phone, though laced with frustration and conflict, stopped short of direct threats. For now he was free, but the police kept him in their sights, wary of the complicated emotions that could still boil over. As the investigation pressed on, the police combed through every detail of Richard Engelbert's life. They dug deep into his professional relationships, hoping to uncover something more: a jilted lover, a business rivalry, or a disgruntled client who may have had a motive for murder. Richard's meticulous lifestyle, once revered in the community, was now under a microscope. They discovered more secret meetups with men in various homes, fueling speculation about whether someone from his double life could have sought revenge. On June 30th, 2014, a break came through. Forensic analysis of Richard's phone uncovered a series of deleted messages, carefully hidden from his wife, his stepson, and even the police's initial review. These messages weren't just casual exchanges, they were intense, emotional, and filled with threats. One in particular stood out. A man Richard had met months before had become increasingly unstable, sending ominous messages hinting at violent retribution if Richard didn't comply with his demands. This man, identified as a client Richard had initially met through his real estate business, had a history of mental health issues and a volatile temper. The messages painted a picture of obsession. Richard had been trying to distance himself from this man, but the client refused to let go. There were threats of exposing their affair, warnings that if Richard didn't do the right thing, something terrible would happen. It wasn't just the language that was alarming. It was the proximity. This man had been in Littleton the week of Richard's murder. Detective Cattle moved quickly. Within hours, a warrant was secured, and the man was brought in for questioning. He was jittery, his eyes darting nervously, sweat beading on his forehead as he sat in the interrogation room. Cattle watched him carefully, the tension thick in the air. "Tell me about Richard Engelbert," Cattle began, his voice steady but probing. The man's hands shook as he responded, stammering through half-formed excuses and vague statements about their relationship. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Under pressure, his story began to unravel, his anger toward Richard bubbling to the surface. He spoke of betrayal, how Richard had promised him things, money, affection, time, and then had abandoned him like all the others. His voice rose as he described feeling used and discarded, as if he were nothing. It was clear to Cattle that this man had been on the edge. But was he the killer? The forensic team worked around the clock, matching DNA samples taken from the crime scene with those of the suspect. The luxury belt found around Richard's neck was re-examined, its material and origin traced. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the final answer remained elusive. As the days wore on, Littleton remained in a state of shock. The town, once so peaceful, was now gripped by fear and gossip. Richard Engelbert's name was whispered in every corner, from coffee shops to schoolyards, as people speculated about the true nature of his life and his death. By early July, the police had built a compelling case against the man whose obsessive messages had come to light. He was charged with Richard's murder, though the community and the Engelbert family were left to grapple with the devastation and unanswered questions. Wendy, though exonerated, found herself isolated in a town that once admired her. Harrison, too, was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered beyond repair. In the end, the murder of Richard Engelbert revealed far more than just a single act of violence. It exposed the fragility of human connections, the dangerous consequences of living double lives, and the darkness that can grow in the shadows of desire, obsession, and betrayal. Littleton would never be the same. Neither would Wendy, Harrison, or anyone else whose lives had been touched by the secrets Richard Engelbert had fought so hard to keep hidden. The footage from the hidden camera sent a jolt of electricity through the investigation. Detective James Cattle, alongside his team, watched in silence as the grainy recording revealed intimate moments from Richard Engelbert's secret life. For weeks, the camera had captured clandestine meetings in the basement, hidden beneath the veneer of Richard's respectable existence. What began as routine surveillance quickly morphed into the most critical piece of evidence the investigation had uncovered yet. As the tape played, the team saw Richard in the hours leading up to his death, greeting various men, engaging in hurried conversations, and finally, the fateful meeting that occurred on the day of the murder. The footage showed Richard pacing in the basement, nervous, checking his phone frequently. Moments later, the camera recorded the arrival of an unexpected visitor. This wasn't one of his usual contacts. It was someone with an agitated posture, their face partially obscured by a baseball cap. The timestamp on the footage read 2:30 p.m., less than an hour before Wendy Engelbert had returned home. As the visitor entered the frame, tension filled the room where the detectives watched the tape. The man stood close to Richard, their conversation barely decipherable, but the body language was unmistakable. Aggression, frustration, and something darker brewing underneath. The detectives leaned in closer as the visitor gestured wildly, their movements increasingly erratic. Richard, clearly taken aback, tried to calm him down. Then, without warning, the visitor lunged. The two struggled, their fight spilling across the basement floor. The camera shook slightly as the scuffle intensified. Finally, the moment they'd been waiting for, the visitor grabbed the luxury belt from a nearby chair and wrapped it around Richard's neck. It was all there. The violent culmination of Richard's double life caught on tape. The detectives watched in horror as the visitor tightened the belt, the life draining from Richard as the minutes dragged on. When the act was complete, the killer adjusted their cap, looked around the room, and fled. Detective Cattle, his sharp eyes locked on the screen, felt a rush of adrenaline. They had a face, albeit a partially obscured one, but they had something even more valuable: a time, a motive, and a killer in action. This wasn't just a theory anymore. The camera had given them the evidence they needed to move forward. But who was this visitor? Despite the shaky footage, there was enough detail in the figure's movements and build to warrant further investigation. Detective Cattle immediately ordered the team to enhance the footage, isolate the clearest frames of the visitor's face, and run it through every possible database they had. They needed to identify this person now. Meanwhile, the detectives revisited the list of suspects. Harrison, Wendy, Alexa, none of them matched the man in the footage. This was someone different, someone outside the immediate circle but still connected to Richard's hidden life. The messages Richard had received, the threats, all pointed to a dangerous figure circling the edges of his clandestine world. As the investigation pressed forward, Detective Cattle and his team worked relentlessly to trace the visitor's identity. They combed through phone records, emails, and contacts from Richard's business. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. The visitor had been one of Richard's clients, a man whose obsessive behavior had already raised alarms during earlier stages of the investigation. This client, whose name had surfaced in the deleted messages, had been angry, furious even, when Richard tried to cut off their illicit meetings. With the evidence mounting, the police made their move. On July 5, 2014, just days after discovering the hidden camera, they tracked down the suspect at a motel on the outskirts of Denver. He had been lying low, evading contact, but it was too late. The forensic team had matched his DNA to samples found at the crime scene. The evidence was undeniable. When Detective Cattle and his team arrived, they found the suspect in a state of disarray, disheveled, paranoid, and fully aware that the net had closed around him. As they led him into custody, his silence spoke volumes. The investigation that had begun as a tangled web of secrets, deception, and betrayal had finally uncovered the truth. The arrest of Richard Engelbert's killer sent shockwaves through Littleton. The case had exposed not only the dark underbelly of Richard's life, but also the lengths to which people would go when consumed by jealousy, obsession, and desperation. As Detective Cattle reflected on the case, he knew it would be one of those that stayed with him. It wasn't just the brutality of the murder or the complexity of the relationships that had made it so haunting. It was the fragility of the human heart, the way secrets could fester in the shadows until they erupted into violence. The case was closed, but the scars it left on the Engelbert family and the town would take far longer to heal. Wendy, though free of suspicion, had lost not just her husband, but the foundation of her life. Harrison, too, faced an uncertain future, burdened by the knowledge of his own complicated relationship with Richard. In the end, the murder of Richard Engelbert was a tragedy that went far beyond the act of violence itself. It was a stark reminder that even the most perfect lives can hide the darkest truths. Hey, True Crime Sketches solvers, what do you think of this shocking case? Did the hidden camera reveal what you expected, or did this twist catch you off guard? Be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most perplexing mysteries. And if you have any theories or cases you'd like us to investigate, leave a comment below. Stay safe, and remember, the truth always has a way of surfacing. The courtroom in Littleton, Colorado was tense with anticipation on August 15, 2014, as the trial of Harrison Engelbert began. The trial was not just about the facts of a murder. It was about betrayal, family secrets, and the unraveling of a seemingly perfect life. Local and national media packed the courtroom, eager to capture every detail of the case that had captivated a small town and beyond. As the prosecution laid out its case, the evidence was damning. The video footage from the hidden camera, which had captured the fatal confrontation between Harrison and his stepfather Richard, was presented to the jury. The prosecution played the footage in the courtroom, a grim reminder of the brutality of the act. Every gasp from the audience underscored the impact the footage had, not just on the jurors but on everyone present. The prosecution detailed how Harrison, overwhelmed by years of manipulation, deceit, and emotional abuse, had snapped in a moment of uncontrollable rage. They painted a picture of a young man caught in the toxic dynamics of his family, manipulated by both his stepfather and mother, Wendy Engelbert, whose own ambitions had clouded her judgment. Harrison's confession, given during his final interrogation with Detective Cattle, was the centerpiece of the case. The defense, however, focused on the emotional and psychological toll that Richard Engelbert's manipulation had on Harrison. They argued that Harrison had been a victim, not only of the affair but of years of deceit that had chipped away at his mental state. Harrison's attorney described his actions as the result of extreme emotional duress, pointing to his troubled past, his attempts at rehabilitation, and the immense pressure from his relationship with his stepfather. Wendy Engelbert, despite not being charged with any crime, became a pivotal figure in the trial. The defense painted her as a master manipulator who had used Harrison as a pawn in her desire to maintain control over Richard's actions. Witnesses testified about her pressure on Harrison, particularly in the months leading up to the murder, to keep the affair secret to protect her public image and her career ambitions. While she wasn't directly on trial, Wendy's involvement in the complex family dynamics weighed heavily on the minds of the jurors and the community. As testimony continued, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Harrison's emotional turmoil was evident throughout the trial. He sat quietly, often staring down at his hands, a mixture of regret and exhaustion etched across his face. He had admitted to the murder, but the trial was now about understanding the full context of his actions, whether they stemmed from cold-blooded intent or years of manipulation that had pushed him past his breaking point. Richard Engelbert's family and friends were also present, grappling with the revelation of his double life. The man they had once known as a devoted husband and father had been leading a secret life that had ultimately led to his violent death. The Engelbert family expressed mixed emotions, mourning the loss of Richard while struggling to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the man who had deceived them. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution emphasized the undeniable evidence, Harrison's confession, the video footage, and the history of conflict between Richard and his stepson. The defense, on the other hand, asked the jury to consider the emotional abuse Harrison had suffered, asking for leniency in their judgment. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Harrison Engelbert was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom, filled with a heavy silence, watched as the judge pronounced the sentence. Harrison was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a decision that reflected both the severity of the crime and the tragic circumstances that had led him down this path. The trial brought a sense of closure to the case, but the emotional aftermath would linger for years. The Engelbert family, shattered by the truth, now faced the task of rebuilding their lives in the shadow of scandal and loss. Littleton, too, was left grappling with the impact of the case, a small town forever marked by the dark secrets that had been unearthed. As the final chapter of Richard Engelbert's life came to a close, one truth remained clear. Beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect lives, darkness can lurk, waiting for a moment to tear everything apart. True Crime Sketches solvers, what are your thoughts on the outcome of this case? Was justice served, or do you think there was more to the story? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping crime stories. Stay safe and always remember, the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will find its way to the surface. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Laura Mitchell, a 45-year-old with a commanding presence in the courtroom and a fierce commitment to justice. She was relentless in her pursuit of a conviction, arguing that Harrison Engelbert's murder of his stepfather, Richard Engelbert, stemmed from a deep well of anger and betrayal, emotions that had been brewing for years. To Mitchell, this was not a simple crime of passion. It was the culmination of a complex, twisted relationship that ended in a brutal and premeditated act of violence. The hidden camera footage and Harrison's confession served as the linchpins of her case, clear evidence that Harrison had knowingly taken his stepfather's life in a moment of raw rage. The defense, led by non-binary attorney Z. Barnes, a 40-year-old renowned for handling high-profile cases, painted a different picture. Barnes argued that Harrison's actions, while undeniably tragic, were the result of intense emotional distress and manipulation. They pointed the finger at both Richard and Wendy Engelbert, suggesting that Harrison had been driven to a breaking point by their toxic influence. Richard's infidelity, combined with Wendy's pressure to keep the affair hidden, had left Harrison emotionally fractured. Barnes argued that the act, while violent, was not premeditated, but rather the consequence of years of psychological turmoil. They pushed for a lesser charge, hoping for leniency given the complex emotional factors at play. Throughout the trial, Richard's family sat in stunned silence. Wendy Engelbert, once seen as the composed and dedicated wife of a successful man, appeared a shadow of her former self. The courtroom proceedings had revealed secrets she had hoped to bury forever: her knowledge of the affair, her manipulative role in the ongoing deception, and the heavy price it had extracted from her family. Other relatives, equally shocked, struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the truths that had emerged. It was a tragic spectacle of family drama laid bare for the world to see. On September 5, 2014, the jury returned with its verdict. Harrison Engelbert was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury, after much deliberation, had concluded that while Harrison's actions were driven by uncontrollable rage, they did not believe the murder was premeditated. The decision split the courtroom. Some saw justice in the verdict, recognizing the psychological complexities that had shaped Harrison's actions. Others believed the sentence was too lenient, given the brutality of the crime. Harrison was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The weight of the sentence settled heavily on his shoulders as he faced the reality of his future. The courtroom, once buzzing with the intensity of the trial, quieted as the family absorbed the finality of the judgment. Wendy, looking pale and exhausted, remained seated, her face a mask of grief and shock. The Engelbert family had been torn apart by secrets, and now they had to live with the consequences of those hidden lives. The sentencing marked the end of the trial, but for the Engelbert family, the emotional aftermath had only just begun. The damage Richard's double life had caused would leave scars that would take years, if not a lifetime, to heal. The community of Littleton, too, was left shaken by the revelations. The scandal had exposed the dark undercurrents that can run beneath the surface of even the most respectable families, forcing many to confront the uncomfortable truth about the people they thought they knew. As Harrison began his 25-year sentence, his life behind bars mirrored the struggles he had faced on the outside. He was reportedly withdrawn and introspective, spending much of his time in education programs offered by the prison system. He sought counseling to cope with the emotional fallout from his relationship with Richard and the tragic events that had led to the murder. Wendy Engelbert's life also took a dramatic turn. The trial had shattered her reputation, not just as a wife but as a community leader. Her candidacy for school superintendent, a position she had worked tirelessly to attain, fell apart in the wake of the scandal. The community's trust in her was irreparably damaged by the revelations that she had known about the affair and had pressured Harrison to maintain it for the sake of her public image. Wendy quietly withdrew from public life, seeking therapy to address the emotional scars left by the ordeal. Her perfect facade had crumbled, leaving her to rebuild her life in the shadow of the tragedy. In the months that followed the trial, Littleton tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the murder of Richard Engelbert had left an indelible mark on the town. Memorials were held in Richard's honor, though the man now remembered was far more complicated than the polished real estate agent the community had once admired. Support groups were formed for those affected by the case, as many in the town struggled to process the events that had unfolded. The Engelbert family, once seen as a model of success, had become a cautionary tale of how secrets and lies can fester and destroy even the most carefully constructed lives. The trial may have brought closure in a legal sense, but the emotional wounds it left behind would take far longer to heal. Harrison would spend decades behind bars grappling with the guilt and consequences of his actions. Wendy would live with the knowledge that her own decisions had contributed to the tragedy that had ripped her family apart. Thank you for joining us on this episode of True Crime Sketches. The murder of Richard Engelbert is a tragic reminder of how betrayal, manipulation, and hidden secrets can destroy lives. What do you think about this case? Was justice truly served? Or do you think the outcome reflects the deeper complexities of the situation? Share your thoughts with us in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth investigations into the most perplexing crimes. Stay safe and remember, the truth, no matter how hidden, always finds its way to the surface.